Hopefully. All right. Today we're going to get to talk a little bit about ancient covenantal structure. The Torah portion for this week is Deuteronomy. We're starting the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, which is chapters 1 through 3, verse 23, I believe. I think that's the verse. But we have a unique opportunity with us starting this book to talk a lot about the different types of ancient covenantal structure that was happening in the ancient Near East, okay? And how many of you have ever heard that the book of Deuteronomy is set up just like a suzerain vassal treaty? 1, 2. A suzerain vassal treaty. This is where we're going to get to explain the book of Deuteronomy and how the entire Bible is set up as a constitution for the nation of Israel. The Bible was never meant to be a history book, okay? The Bible is meant to be a covenantal document that shows the constitution to the Commonwealth of Israel. And I want to be able to go through the various types of ancient treaties and covenants that were going on in the ancient Near East, so you'll be able to see many of these embedded actually in Scripture. Okay, so why would the book of Deuteronomy be set up as a suzerain vassal treaty and a covenant when it was established in the book of Exodus at Sinai? Well, the reason for that is because in the ancient world, remember that kingdoms didn't interact with each other kind of like how they do today. You know, we see all of these videos on Fox News and interviews where they'll show all these various leaders that are just calling up other leaders on the phone, and just intermingling and doing diplomacy with them like that. In the ancient world, it wasn't like that. Okay, and in order for us to understand this covenant a little bit better, is we have to go back and study how these nations interacted with each other. This is not working very well. Now, this picture that I have up here is something that I wanted to give you a visual that I personally believe that if Yeshua was on this earth right now in our generation and he walked into the grand country of the United States, is that he would use a lot of the things that are going on within our own culture and within our own government and stuff like that to help us understand who he is even better. And why do I say that? Because that's exactly what he did while he was walking on the earth in the first century. Okay? So I believe that he would use things such as politics and democracy, equality, diversity, all of these hot topics, immigration. He would use all of these. I mean, immigration is huge. If you look at immigration from a standpoint of the first century and the way that he was trying to include the entire world, include all the generations of the world that were from the very beginning to the end, I mean, that's basically an immigration policy right there. So he would use, I believe, a lot of these things that are embedded in our own culture, embedded in our own government in this country, and also how other countries would interact with us to basically show who he is, show who the Father is, show what the covenant is, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when we look at that from our own mindset and our own perspective of living here today, this is exactly what he did in the first century. I mean, he used things such as suzerain vassal treaties, adoption, the concept of honor and shame, all of these things, patronage, patron-client relationships, and as you guys continue to come here, you'll hear me talk a lot about those other things. Okay, so the book of Deuteronomy is basically set up as a suzerain vassal treaty, and I'm going to get into the definitions of that and to show you why it was set up that way and to show you why it is a legal document, and that when we go around saying that certain books of the Bible have been done away with, then we're going to get ourselves into trouble. So I wanted to begin actually with the verses in Matthew chapter 5. For those of you who are new to understanding Torah and coming into these concepts, just allow me an opportunity to present the information from a little bit of a different perspective than what we're used to coming in and out of the church. Okay, because we have to understand the Bible is a legal document. It doesn't mean that we're justified by keeping laws. It means that we keep the Torah, we keep the commandments out of our love for the Creator, and that we are justified through the work of Yeshua. Okay, as long as that disclaimer is out there, we're clear. You could allow me to present the evidence to, all of those things. So Matthew chapter 5. Can you guys see that okay? If there's colors that you don't like that I'm using in the PowerPoint, I don't know what it's going to look like until I put it up on the screen on how dark or how light it is. So hopefully you guys can see that. But I usually read most of the stuff that's on there anyway. But Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I came to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to complete. For truly I say to you, till the heaven and the earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall by no means pass from the Torah till all be done. We've all heard these verses 100 times. If you've been in the Hebraic roots or Messianic movement for any length of time, I mean, we know these verses. These are the verses that we usually go and we start beating the Christians over the head with. I mean, let's be honest, but different perspective we got to learn. Whoever then breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches men so shall be called the least in the reign of the heavens, but whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the reign of heavens. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall by no means enter into the reign of heavens. Why does he say this? Because covenant is a legal document. He cannot, if Yeshua shows up and he says that the covenant's been done away with, the Torah's been done away with, when it's a legal document establishing Israel as a nation and its citizens as being part of that nation, then he's automatically disqualifying himself. Okay? So let's look at some of the various types of covenants that were going on in the ancient Near East. Obviously, as always, if you guys email me, I'll give you the PowerPoint, I'll give you the resource that I use for this stuff, and you can look at it. I know you will. Roger. So the very first type I want to talk about is the royal grant. And it is an unconditional covenant between a king and the person in which he chooses to give the grant. A king's grant of land or some other benefits to a loyal servant for faithful or exceptional service. The grant was normally perpetual and unconditional, but his servants' heirs, he benefited from it only as they continued their father's loyalty and service. You can see this in 1 Samuel 8, verses 14, 22, and 7. 27 verse 6, and Esther 8, 1. Now, to give you a little bit of an example with this, as far as giving a piece of land, we automatically see that Yahweh gives Israel this chunk of land after they come out of Egypt, right? So they got to go through this 40-year wilderness period, and then one of the things that he grants them is this piece of land. He gives them all the borders and all this stuff and tells them where their boundaries should be set up and so on and so forth. And if you move somebody's boundary, that's a sin and all this other kind of stuff. Well, that is what is called as a royal land grant. Okay? Now, to push this all the way up to where we are today, this is why it's extremely important that we pay attention when people are trying to take away the land of Israel. Okay? In 2012, you had 330-some nations that went to the United Nations and basically said that the land didn't belong to Israel, it belongs to the Palestinians/Muslims or whatever, and they wanted to go back to reestablishing 1967 borders. As soon as they do that, that allows the Creator, which the Creator doesn't need to be allowed to do anything, obviously, but he does everything in a legal manner in which, so people will understand exactly what's happening and nobody could bring a lawsuit against him. So once they go to all of the nations in this big giant body of the world leaders and say that that land doesn't belong to Israel, it belongs to us, the people that it was not granted to, that opens the door for him to basically bring retribution upon all of those lands, right? That's a declaration of war. In the ancient world, if you're a king and you went over and you wanted to conquer somebody else's land, you went over there and you moved borders and you attacked the people and you took their land. That was a declaration of war, so the kingdoms would fight amongst each other trying to take this land or keep this land or so on and so forth. Okay, it's the same way that we're doing things today. You know, everybody wants to be a prophecy teacher, but if you're not recognizing the way that ISIS right now is doing things, and they're doing things exactly the way that ancient kingdoms would do. They form a military campaign. Their kingdom is basically established off of this giant army that they create. And then they go from land to land, taking away people's borders. They take all the resources. They tear down all of their gods, their temples, their churches, or whatever, and then they do away with the people. Why? Because in the ancient world, when you want to annihilate people, that's what you did. You annihilated their temples. You just did away with all of their gods to act as if they never even existed. This is exactly what ISIS has been doing for the last 4 to 5 years now, maybe even longer. So they're going through all of these lands, and instead of establishing, stones to put up their boundaries, what are they putting up? Flags. That black, ugly flag that you see with that stupid symbol they got on there, instead of putting up a boundary stone, flags are the modern-day boundary markers. They're declaring to the world that this land is now ours. If you want to understand prophecy a little bit, then we have to go back and see how these kingdoms interacted with each other, okay? So the kings in the ancient world, they didn't call people up on the phone and do diplomacy. You went to war. That king led you into war, and you fought against the nations that you fought against, and that king led you. Can you imagine if this president ever led us into any type of war? Oh my gosh. We would lose in a heartbeat. So a royal grant in Genesis 9, verses 8 through 17, made with righteous Noah and his descendants, and every living thing on the earth, all life that is subjected to man's jurisdiction. The description of this covenant: an unconditional divine promise never to destroy all earthly life with the same natural catastrophe. The covenantal sign being the rainbow in the storm cloud. Now you can see how this symbol of the rainbow is an everlasting covenant. It's a grant covenant that he bestows on all of creation, saying that he's not going to destroy them the exact same way that he did at that time. And then he gives them a sign. Remember what we talked about, I think we talked about it here, when we talked about the staff and how certain things were signs of, these covenants and all these things that Yahweh does. He puts signs in place so we all recognize that as a sign. Well, the adversary has taken this rainbow, and obviously we know what he's trying to do with it. Is he's trying to corrupt it to make it mean something else, and now every time somebody sees a rainbow, automatically their mind's going to something horrific and evil, because he's trying to corrupt everything that the Creator does. Royal Grant Covenant, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Participants made with Abraham, conditional that he would leave all his country, kindred, and the father's house, and follow the Lord into the land which he would show him. The promise was a fourfold blessing. Number 1, increase into a numerous people, material and spiritual prosperity, the exaltation of Abraham's name. Abraham was not only to be blessed by God, but to be a blessing to others implicitly by the coming of the Messiah through his descendants. This is a huge grant. A huge grant. Now keep in mind is that at the very beginning slide we talked about how that king could actually take it away if the person wasn't faithful. Well, when you give a land grant to somebody for being faithful in the ancient world, is that king normally would not take that grant away. Obviously we see that Yahweh took the grant away because of disobedience, idolatry, and all these things that happen with the covenant, so he sends them into exile. But he doesn't really take away the land because it always leaves a remnant there. In the ancient world, Israel was not the only one that did these type of covenants or these grants or these, different type of legal contracts. All of the ancient Near Eastern nations would do them. The Assyrians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, all of them. And when they would give land grants, the only way that the land grant could be taken away from them is if the king died, and then the next king rises up and decides, look, you shouldn't have this land, and this king ends up being corrupt, and he decides to take this land away from this person, and he gives it to somebody else. Well, the thing with our king is our king doesn't die. This is why it's so important that we recognize what's going on with that chunk of land over there attached to Israel. Because when you try to take a land grant away from somebody, that's a declaration of war. You follow? Is it making sense? Okay. The royal land grant in Genesis 15, made with righteous Abram and his descendants. Obviously, this is what we've been talking about. Renewal of the Abrahamic covenant with unconditional divine promise to fulfill the grant of land, a self-maledictory oath, symbolically enacted it. Now I want to read this. Everybody turn to Genesis 15. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is everything that we believe is based off of these chapters in Genesis 15. Especially when we have to deal with those on a consistent basis that say that, you've got to have this specific bloodline or whatever. So Genesis 15:1, and these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. Abram said, O Yahweh, my Elohim, what will you give me, since I am childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, since you have been given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of Yah came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, now look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. I want to skip down a little bit. Verse 12. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation who nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you will be buried in a good old age, and then in the fourth generation they will return here, after the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now here's the kicker right here in verse 17. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between the pieces. On that day Yah made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the Euphrates. It goes on to tell all the other lands that you're taking. What does this have anything to do with what we're talking about? The covenant of the pieces. What exactly is happening here is he tells Abram he's going to make a covenant with him. They take all of these animals and they cut them in half, right? Hopefully I can come down here without this thing squealing. If it does, I'll just jump. So what they do is they take these animals, and I wish I had some examples. Where's... my kids are busy. I was going to use my kids. But they cut all these animals in half, right? And what they would do, and this is not just Israel. This is, like I said, this is the Egyptians, the Hittites. All of these nations would have these same sort of ceremonies for covenant. So what they would do is they would cut these animals in half, and they would split them and they'd lay them right open, right? And then the person that is coming into covenant with the other person is they would walk between these pieces, which is saying is that if I don't, the oath that I speak, if I don't keep this oath, may what happened to these animals happen to me. You ever heard this before? So this is exactly what happened in the book of Ezekiel, where one of the kings actually did this, didn't keep the covenant or the oath that he spoke, and then he ended up, Yah ended up taking him out because of the way that they did this ceremony. So what's happening in Genesis 15 is the smoking torch that's walking through there. That's actually Yahweh in the form of the smoking torch, right? That's him making the oath that he will continue to bless Israel and bless Abraham's descendants to bring them back into that land. That's why nobody could take the land, because it's Yahweh that made the oath. Even though Israel has to make an oath also, Yahweh's the one who made the oath that said that I will make sure that this happens. Because of Abraham's obedience, Abraham's loyalty, Abraham's love for the Creator, and all of his descendants, even though Israel, we know that breaks it. So the whole dread thing that's going on, talking about where dread and terror came over Abram, does anybody have an opinion on what that was? I'm sure we all probably have an opinion. My personal opinion on what that actually was is I believe that Yahweh was showing Abram the means in which he was going to make sure that that covenant was fulfilled with Yeshua. I believe that Abram saw Yeshua on the stake at that moment. And that's why he did not hesitate when they said to come and he wanted him to offer Isaac. He did not hesitate because, one, he knew Yah was either going to resurrect Isaac or he knew that he was going to give him another descendant because of what he saw in Genesis 15. Does that make sense? So when people try to go around telling you that, you've got to be Jewish to be in this covenant, it says right here that I could be grafted into Abram because I believe the same covenant that Abraham does. And I place my faith and my trust in Yeshua as the Messiah and all this other type of stuff. It doesn't have anything to do with you being Jewish. You're grafted into the nation of Israel by your oath and then the covenant which you keep. And then you get an inheritance. This is why in the book of Ezekiel it talks about the nations, the Gentiles that join themselves to Israel, they now get an inheritance in the kingdom. It doesn't say that anywhere else in the Torah. It talks about it in the millennial kingdom when Yeshua is born. Royal grant continued again, made with the zealous priest Pinchas, an unconditional divine promise to maintain the family of Pinchas and a perpetual priesthood. Oh, we're going to get controversial here in a second. Implicitly a pledge to Israel to provide for her forever with a faithful priesthood. We've talked about this a little bit, since we started here in April, but there's all this talk going around now is because Yeshua has come along that now we all get to join this Melchizedek type of priesthood, and now we're priests. I'm going to propose to you that those verses that talk about Melchizedek priesthood doesn't have anything to do with you and I can now waltz into the heavenly temple and do things on our own behalf. Remember, the Bible is a temple text. That means from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, that is talking about the Bible being a temple. Or not the Bible, but Yah's temple, and the Bible is describing the heavenly temple and the earthly temple. This slide right here talking about the grant given to Pinchas, that's given to the sons of Aaron as a grant When you try to take their priesthood away, or you say that it's done away with, even though we don't have a heavenly or an earthly temple right now, and people are going around saying, well, that's because they did away with it. He's just taking it away for a little bit right now. That doesn't mean that you get to disqualify them and speak against the things that are happening over there with a priesthood and with an altar and with an earthly temple. We have no idea what we're saying. It's been given to them as a grant. You might as well just say that the land's done away with. You follow? We've got to be careful in what we're saying, even as we're listening to all these people that are trying to establish themselves as leaders and teachers in this movement and coming up with all these crazy doctrines. If you understand ancient covenantal principles between nations and kings and servants and kings and his people, and you understand grants, you cannot take away a grant from somebody. You don't have that authority. I don't have that authority. So the priesthood is very, very important to understand that there are two orders to the priesthood. There's an order that goes to the heavenly temple, which is Yeshua only. You and I are not part of that order. And then you have the Levitical, which he established to take care of the earthly temple. And the earthly temple is going to be established again, and he's going to establish that priesthood again. That's basic reading in the scriptures. I don't understand what the difficulty is with that, but okay. 2 Samuel 7, made with faithful King David, after his devotion to God as Israel's king and the Lord's anointed vassal, had come to special expression. An unconditional divine promise to establish and maintain the Davidic dynasty on the throne of Israel, implicitly a pledge to Israel to provide her forever with a godly king like David, and through that dynasty to do for her what he had done through David, bring her into rest into the promised land. What's this talking about? He gave the grant of the kingship of the earthly dynasty to who? To David. So that means nobody could take that away. Any other kings that try to establish themselves, that's a declaration of war. The head king, which is Yahweh, established the order of who's supposed to be king. It's supposed to come through the line of David, and that's the line that Yeshua would come through. Why does Yeshua have to come through that line? Well, one, because it shows twofold. One, that he is the heir to the earthly kingdom, and number two, he is the heir to the heavenly kingdom. So it's very, very important to understand both roles. Roll grant Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. The promise to rebellious Israel as she is about to be expelled from the promised land in actualization of the most severe covenantal curse. Leviticus 26, 27 through 39, Deuteronomy 28, and 45 through 68. An unconditional divine promise to unfaithful Israel to forgive her sins and establish his relationship with her on a new basis of writing his law in their heart. A covenant of pure grace. I don't necessarily agree with the pure grace part, but... And the reason why I don't agree with the pure grace part is because if you understand grace from a covenantal perspective in a patron-client relationship, grace is something that the patron would give you, and then you have to give them something in return. Well, what do you give them in return? This is first century, Roman culture, Israel culture, and all that kind of stuff. What you give them in return is that patron does something for you, which is called grace, and then you are loyal to them. You go around proclaiming to them who your patron is, going through the streets and trying to get everybody else to come underneath the authority of your patron because your patron did this for you, did this for you, did this for you, did this for you. It's a reciprocal relationship. Grace is not anything like we have ever been taught in all of the years that we were in the church. It has nothing to do with, okay, here, I give you grace, continue to do whatever it is you want. Break the covenant. Makes no sense. It's a reciprocal, legal relationship that you have with somebody. It's just like most of us here that are parents, you have the same relationship with your kids, Dylan, is that you provide all of these things for them, and in return you expect them to be obedient, you expect them to grow up and to do all the things that you instill in them, and their relationship like that. I want him to go through the streets and tell how great his mom is, and do all of those type of things. But you see, that's the definition of what grace really is. It's not just, okay, here it is, and then hey, just go break whatever laws I gave you. Another type of covenant is the parity covenant, a covenant between equals, binding them to mutual friendship or at least to mutual respect for each other's fears and interests. Participants called each other brothers. We see this in Genesis 21. You can read the verse, but two really good examples is between Abraham and Lot. Abraham and Lot were in this legal relationship with each other. When they left the land of Ur, they were in a relationship not only because they were related, but because they entered into a specific covenant with each other which was a parity covenant. They were obligated to one another. This is why when Lot decided that he wanted to go one way, Abraham went one way. What happens to Lot? Huh? He went to the city, but then when they came against the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he got taken off into captivity, right? In those verses, it talks about Abraham has to go out to help his brother, which they weren't really brothers. But if you look at the term, it's using the term brother in those verses. Why? Because they were in a legal relationship with one another, and they were obligated to take care of one another, even though Lot decided to go this way and Abraham went this way. And because that they were in this covenant together, he goes and Abraham defeats, who knows, I can't remember how many people, like 300 guys. Rescues Lot, brings him back, so on and so forth. That's an example of a parity covenant. Also, David and Jonathan were in this same type of covenant. Remember when David was having issues with Saul, and he had to go and hide, and they had this relationship that, Jonathan would let him know, all these other type of things. They were in a covenantal relationship with each other as a parity covenant. They looked out for each other's interests and did all of these things. That's another type of covenant. Suzerain and vassal, this is where we're going to get into basically looking into Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is actually pretty amazing when we realize that it's structured exactly how ancient Near Eastern suzerain and vassal treaties were set up. And the reason why that is because remember that kingdoms interacted with kingdoms differently than we understand. When a king was on his deathbed, okay, and they were appointing the next heir, the next king, is that they were supposed to gather the people together, reestablish that covenant with the people under the authority of the next king. Okay? Keep that in mind as we're going through this, because you're going to be able to make connections to see that this is not just in Deuteronomy. It's several other places. So what is a suzerain vassal? It's a conditional covenant regulating the relationship between a great king and one of his subject kings. The great king claimed absolute right of sovereignty, demanded total loyalty and service. The vassal must love his suzerain and pledge protection of the subject's realm and dynasty, conditional on the vassal's faithfulness and loyalty to him. Now, let's talk about the word love for a second. I think we might have mentioned this a little bit in the past, but, we come out of, most of us have come out of the Christian church in understanding love in a way that it was never meant to be defined in Scripture. Love in Scripture is actually the word that's often used to describe that is the Hebrew word yada. And it actually means to be loyal as a king and a servant. It isn't, hey, I really love you, I'm just going to dismiss all of the wrong things that you're doing, give me a hug and a kiss, bro, and we're going to just be on our merry way. No, love in the ancient world is directly in terms of a kingdom servant mentality, which means you are loyal to the king in which you serve. If you're not loyal to him, we know what happens. So why is it that we go through this mindset of thinking that, we just need to forgive, and trust me, we need to forgive. Disclaimer. But we just think that we need to let everybody just walk all over us, and because Jesus says that we have to love everybody, that's the mentality that we get. Because we don't understand what love actually is in the ancient world. It's like a husband and wife. We love our wife and we love our husbands and all that kind of stuff, but what does that mean? That means that you are loyal to that person. Despite whatever goes on in your marriage, you are loyal to that person. Yes, there's a different connotation of love that's attached to a husband and wife, but that's just one aspect of it because we're loyal to each other. Okay? That means that we hold each other's interests, and the Father has brought us into union with this person or that person, and we just don't love them in a physical sense. We love them because we're loyal to them. We want to serve our spouse and all these types of things. So this is the definition of love between kingdoms. This is why it's like that in the first century writings as well. I just skipped a slide. So the vassal pledged absolute loyalty to his suzerain, whatever service his suzerain demanded, and exclusive reliance on the suzerain's protection. Participants called each other Lord, servant, father, and son. So when you have a king that entered into covenant with another vassal nation, so you had the suzerain, which is the head king, and you had a vassal, which vassal means servant. It was a servant king that was under the authority of this king. And then they would also use other terms such as father and son, okay? And Lord and servant. Examples of this is Genesis 17, made with Abram as a patriarchal head of his household. A conditional divine pledge to be Abraham's God and the God of his descendants. The condition, total consecration to the Lord as symbolized by circumcision. So the circumcision was meant to be a sign of his covenant with the Creator. Okay, you see how he enters into a covenant, and then there's got to be a visual sign, just like all of these other aspects of covenant. Exodus 19 through 24, made with Israel as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and as the people, and the Lord has redeemed from bondage to an earthly power, a conditional divine pledge to be Israel's God as her protector and the guarantor of her blessed destiny. The condition, Israel's total consecration to the Lord as his people and his kingdom, who live by his rule and serve his purpose in history. Now, once we go through all the different parts that were established, and there's like 6 or 7 parts that are established in the suzerain-vassal treaty, is Exodus chapter 24 is a mini treaty by itself, and Joshua chapter 24 has very specific elements of all of those things in just that chapter alone. Why would it have it in Joshua? Why would it have it in Exodus 24? Well, Exodus 20 through 24, that's the establishment of the original covenant at Sinai, right? So it's going to have elements of all of these things that are embedded in an actual structured ancient Near Eastern suzerain vassal treaty. Why? Because Yah is basically saying, okay, I'm going to be your king. This is what you got. Here's all of the things that I need you to do. And then he appoints Moshe as the leader. He appoints Aaron as the high priest. Well, in Joshua chapter 4, or 24, they're reestablishing it because Joshua's getting ready to die. So he's got to pass that on to the next generation, right? Suzerainty occurs where a region or people is a tributary to a more powerful entity which controls its foreign affairs while allowing the tributary vassal state some limited domestic autonomy. The dominant entity in the suzerain relationship, or the more powerful entity itself, is called a suzerain. The regions or nations that are lesser in power become vassals to the suzerain. Now, in the ancient world, the suzerain was constantly changing hands. If you go back and you look at the late Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age, and all of these different time frames that during these specific areas, is the Hittites were at one point a suzerain, the Egyptians were a suzerain, let's see who else, the Mitanni kingdom, all of these ancient kingdoms were exchanging back and forth. And then you even get into the later period where you had the Romans, the Greeks, and all these people were actually becoming suzerains. We see this in the 1st century. Rome comes in and they conquer all of these lands, right? And they embed themselves into Israel. And what does Rome do? Is they put in their puppet governors, their puppet priests, their puppet kings, and all that stuff. And that's to regulate the people so they stay into that treaty that they entered into for Rome. Which meant, by them coming into a treaty with Rome, that means that they had to defend Rome at all costs, or else it was annihilation of the people in which that Rome was ruling. You follow? This is one reason why that when they were screaming for Barabbas over Yeshua, those people that were screaming to give us Barabbas and to crucify Yeshua, the reason why they're doing that is they knew that if they would have said, give us Yeshua, they were proclaiming that Yeshua was the king of Israel. So if you do that in the midst of a people that is Rome that's ruling over you, and you say, give us our king, you're declaring war upon Caesar. This is why they asked for Barabbas, because they didn't want to have to go to war to defend Yeshua as the king in which they were proclaiming that he was. Make sense? A little bit of a different perspective of looking at stuff from a legal standpoint. That's why they put the sign above them. Yes. And there's other reasons why that was up there too, but that's one of them, yes. So the Suzerain Vassal Treaty document of Deuteronomy, exploring the legal text. We're going to look at the 7 elements that you'll find in basically any ancient Near Eastern Suzerain Vassal Treaty. I have a book, and I should have brought that book. I have a book that is about this thick. It's called Ancient Near Eastern Text by Pritchard. And what this book is that they've taken all of these documents that they've found, these archaeological documents and things that they've literally unearthed, and they put them into one volume from all of these different nations, right? If you go in there, you'll see that they have ancient suzerain treaties in there. They have all these other different type of weird documents. But it shows you that it's not just Israel, it's all of these other nations that are doing this. So let's just make one thing clear, and those who have not heard me give this disclaimer 1,000 times at this point, is that Yahweh is not using something pagan to establish his own authority. What he's doing is he's using things that are familiar to the people at the time, because this is how kingdoms interacted with one another. This is why I said, if Yeshua was on the earth right now and in the United States, the state of Kansas, I think that he would use some examples to show us of what we know and how we know the people interact, the kingdoms interact, the states interact with each other, and so on and so forth. So he's doing things and establishing them as a nation legally. So all the world will know that he is the king of them. Because remember, just to give you an example, when kings went to war, is they would take their thrones or whatever it is of their gods, and they were supposed to lead the people. This is why that Yahweh would tell Aaron and Moses to take the ark. Why? Because they actually saw the cloud of fire and the cloud of smoke or whatever. The people actually saw, in a visual sense, what their same people, their same gods were proclaiming to do, but they never saw any of the miraculous parts to it. So he's using these things to show them that these aren't your gods. These gods aren't real. I'm the one true God of all creation, and I'm doing things in this legal manner to show you who I am. Okay? So he's using these same type of covenants because this is how people interact with each other. And this is all that he's doing. So the first element that you'll see in a suzerain vassal treaty is the preamble. Now write the chapters down, because what I have here is I'm giving you the description of what that element is, and then if you look in the book of Deuteronomy, those are the chapters in which you see it. There's another author named Meredith Kline that has put together a remarkable thesis and a couple of books showing, and he's not just the only one, there's others. But if you just Google suzerain vassal treaties and look at it from some of these people like Moshe Weinfeld and Meredith Kline, they back up all of this evidence that they've found through archaeology and through unearthing all of these things from the ancient world. So I'm going to give you the chapters that you'll actually see each element in the book of Deuteronomy. So the first one's the preamble. The treaty text frequently opens with the statements, "These are the words of," followed by the identification of the king who gives the treaty, his titles, appellatives, and genealogy. The treaty is thus a message from the suzerain to the vassal. I want to look at something really quick. What's the very first verse in Deuteronomy 1 say? Somebody read it. Is anybody there? I'll read it. "These are the words which Moshe spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, in Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Laban, Hazeroth and Dizabah. It is 11 days' journey from the Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. Moshe spoke to the children of Israel." So notice, and I just picked something up as I'm reading this, because Melanie brought this up earlier this morning, that she found out this morning that this is actually the 44th Torah portion, and Moshe is giving this speech in the 40th year after the exile. Why? Because they're getting ready to go into the promised land, right? Moshe is getting ready to die. In case you haven't read the book, spoiler alert, Moses dies at the end of this book. So he's got to gather the people together. And first he says, and this is the words that Moshe spoke. So he gives that Moses is the speaker, and he actually says it twice. But then he's going to go on to talk about how Moshe spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yah had commanded him to give to them after he had defeated Sihon the king, the Amorites who lived in Heshbon and Og. So it's going to go on to talk about all of the deeds that Yahweh has done, which leads us to the second element of the suzerain vassal treaty, which is the historical prologue of what that king has done for you. So they're going to give you the preamble, who's speaking, the dates, and that kind of stuff. And then the very second element of the treaty is they're going to say, well, why are we coming into covenant with you? Why is this nation coming into covenant with this king? And so on and so forth. Remind you, these were kings coming into covenant with kings. Now we have Yahweh, who is the one true creator, is established Israel as a nation with the same type of document. So they have the Constitution. This is what the Bible is. The Bible is meant to show you the Constitution, the legal aspects to everything attached to the land of Israel, and the people of Israel, and the people of the covenant. So the historical prologue. This consists of a description of the previous relationship between the two parties, frequently in thou and I, thou form of address, emphasizing particularly the acts of benevolence which the suzerain has performed for the good of the vassal. These preceding acts of the suzerain are evidently regarded as the foundation of the vassal's obligation and therefore the historical prologue seems to be carefully composed. And you will see this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 6 through 329. This is why most of this Torah portion we're going through basically just a historical prologue of what happened with Israel coming out of Egypt, because it's saying that Yahweh did this, and he overcame all of these gods, which, by the way, he did it by means of a military campaign. He went in there, he rescued the people of Israel, did away with all their gods, militarily defeated them, and that was one of the reasons why Yah's fame just grew and grew and grew and grew until they got to crossing the Jordan in Joshua 1 and 2, and Rahab says what? Yahweh is the heaven above, is the God of heaven above and of the earth below. So she's making a proclamation, a declaration, because why? Because she's living in the land of Canaan at the time. She has all of these beliefs of what supposedly their gods are like, and what, but they've never seen any evidence of it. But now they're witnessing the cloud and all of these things and all these nations that Israel is defeating because Yahweh is going before them, which actually is Yeshua, pre-existing Yeshua, remember, the angel, all that kind of stuff. So that's the second element to a suzerain vassal treaty. We're doing pretty good on time. By the way, how many of you were here when Monty was here? Did you guys like doing the whole Q&A thing around 1:30? I think that we're going to try to do that today. I'm not Monty, but I could throw out some nuggets here and there if you guys want to come back up here at 1:30 or whatever until 2 o'clock, and if we want to just talk about other stuff. I don't want to talk about calendars. I don't want to talk about flat earths. I don't want to talk about, name pronunciations. Let's talk about things that are going to help us grow and that kind of stuff. So if we could go down and eat or whatever, and if you guys want to come up at 1:30, we could do that. I don't know prophecy like Monty does or any of that kind of stuff, but we'll just wing it. You'll help? All right, so number 3, the third aspect is the stipulations. This section contains the obligation to which the vassal binds himself in accepting the covenants defined by the suzerain. The context varies widely, but military obligations are, as expected, treated in detail. First, the vassal must not enter in alliance with other independent kings, and he must be a friend to the suzerain's friends and an enemy to his enemies. You see what I was saying when we talk about the first century, that if the people of Judea would have said, Yeshua is our king now, that means that they're not being a friend to Caesar, and so on and so forth. To the vassal must answer any summons from military forces and engage wholeheartedly in any military campaign commanded by the suzerain. Second, regulations for the treatment of refugees are so frequent that it's necessary to conclude that this was an important issue during this period. Third, war booty is often regulated in advance. This also was evident a fertile source of discord. Most interesting is the frequent prohibition of murmuring. Wow. The utterance of unfriendly words against the suzerain. This is the whole book of Numbers. So they come into covenant with Yahweh in Exodus, right? And then the whole book of Numbers is doing nothing but murmuring and complaining. This is why he does all of these actions against him, because this is actually a declaration of war against the king who you said you're going to serve. Wow. We don't know anything. The utterance of unfriendly words against the suzerain and the obligation to report such words uttered by others. I think we take that part a little too far. We want to utter other stuff by others all the time. Which is often combined in the exhortation to trust the suzerain, even in spite of appearances to the contrary. Finally, a stipulated tribute is imposed. You see this Deuteronomy 4-26. This is basically the reiterance of all the commandments, keeping the feast, keeping Shabbat, doing all these things with the temple. Those chapters, the whole bulk of it is basically the stipulations. Number 4. The deposit in the public reading. Typically, there is a provision for the deposit of the treaty document in the sanctuary of the vassal, and a requirement that it's to be read in public at stipulated intervals from 1 to 4 times a year. That's what it was in the ancient world. How many times are we supposed to get together and read the document? How many years in between as a body? 7 years. Israel is in 7 years where we did, but when, and also where did we deposit the covenant? is the covenant went actually into the ark, right? Now let's take out the 2 tablets. How many here believe that the rendition that is in the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston with the 2 stones is accurate? Nobody. How many of you grew up at least thinking or understanding that the 2 tablets had 5 commandments on one and 5 commandments on the other? Be honest. I did too. We had pictures of them in my house. Chris? Let's look at this. Exodus 32, verse 15. And Moshe turned and went down from the mount, and 2 tables of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both of their sides. You guys can't see the verse. You have to look it up. 32:15. On the one side and on the other side they were written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God graven on the tables. So, what does all that mean? That means that what we've grown up in the Christian church realizing that there was 5 commandments on this one, and that Moshe came down with 5 commandments on this one, is inaccurate. Why did he come down with 2 tablets? Well, because in the ancient world, one was for the God, one was for the people. One was to be deposited underneath the throne of the God or the king in which you serve. So if you take an earthly king and he's sitting on this throne, you come into covenant with him, there was 2 copies of the document. That's what the 10 Commandments was. There's 10 Commandments written on this one, which is known as the Decalogue, the summarization of the entire Torah, as 2 copies. So one went into the ark, and one was kept with Israel. Make sense? We never see this stuff. So we see Charlton Heston coming down off the mountain, and he's busting these 2 tablets or whatever. And in most of it, not this one, but most churches, I mean, they all grow up understanding the same thing, that there's 5 and 5, like he couldn't fit it on one rock. You know what I mean? But there was a reason why it was done, and we never look at things from this perspective. This is just one aspect to show the legality. One was for the king, one was for the people. Right? Oh, boundary stones. We talked about land grants. You'll see that in the book of Joshua, when they get ready to cross into the land, is Yah tells them to establish stones inside the river, and then again when they go inside the land, certain areas. Those are what are known, excuse me, the Babylonian term is called kutaru. It's a Babylonian term, but it stands for boundary stone. And it talks about, setting up boundary stones in the Torah and that kind of stuff. Well, actually, what is on those stones, and he tells Moshe to write stuff on there, that is establishing that Yah gave this land to them. It is the land grant, the covenant is written on these stones. And they set them up. That way anybody that comes into that border, they know, hey, this king gave this land to this person, this king, blah, blah, blah. Now Yahweh is saying, I gave this land to the people of Israel. They established this as soon as inside the river Jordan they're putting this. And then they do it again in other places when they come into the land. Just to show the legality of, they want everybody to see who this land belongs to, who the people are, which God and which king that they serve. They did this in all the other ancient Near Eastern nations. Is this making sense? Is it too much information? Huh? Yes. I don't know if maybe there was something else that was on the rock that I don't, I'd have to look into it. I don't know. Yeah, and I don't think it's plaster like we think it's plaster. It's not like it's drywalled or something like that. Sheetrock. So reading the treaty regularly, custom of periodic public reading of treaty documents, the contents of the 2 tablets were of course declared in the hearing of all Israel, and the book of the covenant was read to the people as part of the ratification ceremony in Exodus 24, verse 7. But the practice of the periodic proclamation was first formulated some 40 years later in the book of Deuteronomy, when God was renewing the covenant unto the 2nd generation. Now, mind you, this is very, very important to understand why we're reading the book of Deuteronomy as a treaty. If he's already established it in Exodus 22-24, why do they have to do it again? Well, as I said, spoiler alert, Moshe dies, but also the original generation that was at Sinai, is this the same generation that's going into the land? No. So they've got to gather the people together. They're going to transfer the authority to Joshua as they cross into the land, And they've got to reestablish their oath to keeping the covenant with Yahweh. Make sense? So this is what they're doing. So when suzerainty covenants were renewed, new documents were prepared in which the stipulations were brought up to date. Instructions were given to Moses at Sinai concerning the two tablets. They were to be deposited in the ark, which in turn was to be placed in the tabernacle in Exodus 25, verse 16. Because Yahweh was at once Israel's covenant suzerain and God of Israel and Israel's oath, there was but one sanctuary for the deposit of both treaty duplicates. The specified location of the documents, as given in the Hittite treaties, can be rendered under the feet of the God, which would then correspond strikingly to the arrangements in the Israelite Holy of Holies. So in the ancient world, like the Egyptian, they would put a copy under their gods, and then the other copy went under the king, because the king would have to bring that out and reiterate all those things every so many years, right? Same thing in ancient Israel. Yahweh's not doing something pagan. He's just doing a process in which they knew that Israel would understand and that all of the other nations would understand. Because he's trying to establish his authority over the whole earth, right? Yes, he started off with Israel, but ultimately what was Israel's role in the very beginning? To go out to all the nations and proclaim who Yahweh was. Did we do that? No. We're still not doing it. Number 5. The fifth element is the list of witnesses. Ancient legal documents normally ended with a list of witnesses, and the international treaties are no exception. Here, however, the gods of both states are named. In fact, some of the lists seem to attempt exhaustiveness in making all known gods of the cultural area witnesses to the covenant. In addition, however, important features of the natural world are included, such as mountains, rivers, springs, and great sea, heaven and earth, winds and clouds. Why do they do that? So all these, they come into covenant with each other. King comes into covenant with these vassal kings. They list all of these other elements, and they basically use all of these natural things that were created, which most of the time these were gods to these people. You know, they all believed that there was river gods and wind gods, storm gods, and all this other kind of stuff. So they invoke all of their gods to say, look, if you're not going to keep this treaty with me as the great king, these gods are the witnesses against you, and you're going to have to suffer all the curses to this treaty. And we're going to talk about the blessings and the curses in a second. So what does Yahweh do? Well, in Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, he invokes heaven and earth as witnesses against us. Why? Because he's the one true God. So he's invoking his own creation as witnesses against the people of Israel that aren't keeping the covenant. Chapter 31, the Song of Moses, it says that is a witness against the people. And so is the song, or the book of law in 31, verse 24. So the ancient Near Eastern nations would invoke their gods as witnesses, and Yahweh's actually using his own creation to be witnesses against us for not keeping the Torah and keeping the treaty. Number 6, the blessings and the curses. This is the sixth element. This consists of a list of goods and calamities which the divine witnesses were called upon to bring upon the vassal for obedience and disobedience respectively. The curses usually precede and consist of the misfortunes usually attributed to the wrath of the gods in antiquity: destruction, sterility, misery, poverty, plague, and famine. The blessings, conversely, are divine protection, continuity of the vassal's line, health, prosperity, and peace. We can see this in Deuteronomy 27 through 28, verse 68. This is where we talk about all the blessings and the curses. And if you notice, the curses are much, much more at length than the blessings are, right? Well, in the Assyrian treaties, if you look and you go back and you study any of the Assyrian suzerain vassal treaties, the treaties of Assyrian and all these people, there was no blessing. You broke it, they killed you. That was it. I mean, you had to keep every stipulation as an individual and as a vassal nation underneath them, or they killed you. They just wiped you out. They didn't care. They didn't want to give you any blessing. Well, the blessing was you got to live if you didn't break it. You know, other than that, there was no extra blessings in it. Seventh element is the ratification ceremony, with oaths and sacrificial meal to show participation of those involved in the covenantal treaty. The oath of compliance. A treaty is a text, but an oath is the actual mechanism whereby the text is ratified and brought to life. No longer just words in a document, but a functioning reality in the lives of the actual people. We have ample evidence of treaties concluding with these rituals of compliance, usually spoken oaths, but sometimes physical gestures. In much the same way treaties today are ratified by signatures and handshakes, activating the new relationships and its terms, it should not be surprising that the biblical story of the covenant at Mount Sinai reaches its climax with the escaped slaves pledging to abide by the covenant obligations, thereby defining and activating themselves as the people of Yahweh. This is in Deuteronomy 29, verses 1, and also in 10 through 15. And just to push this into the renewed covenant in the New Testament, we've all made the same exact oath. We came into covenant with Yeshua and with Yahweh. Most of us didn't even realize that we were doing it in Romans 10:9. If you look up that verse, and it talks about, this is exactly what the churches do, is they get you into church and they say, look, you want to be saved? Come on up here to the altar. We'll go through Romans 10:9. You just confess. That's my hillbilly voice. You confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe he was risen from the dead and all this kind of stuff, and then you're saved. Well, they don't understand the legality of what they're trying to get you to do. Is you're doing exactly what this says, is you're giving an oath of compliance that, hey, I want to come into a covenant with Yahweh. I want to come into a covenant with Yeshua. Does that mean I believe he's raised from the dead, and I walk out the door and I break all the commandments? No. The word that he's talking about using for confess, and I'm a huge proponent of studying Greek. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. But the majority of the texts that we have in the New Testament are in Greek, people. They are, we could do all of the Hebrew stuff we want, but most of the texts that we have are in Greek. But if you understand the language and understand that the reason why some of that stuff is there is because it's legal terminology, okay? And if you understand the legality between how these people interacted with each other, even in the first century, as you can see the legality through that verse in Romans 10:9. That word that he's using for confess is the word homologeo, and it actually means that you're professing to walk in the same covenant as the person that you're professing to have faith in. That means Yeshua. He kept the Torah, he kept the commandments, he kept the covenant, so I'm going to walk just like he walked. You're giving an oath. Why? Because Yeshua is the heir to the dynasty. He is the restoration that Yahweh sent to us. That's why we proclaim an oath and belief in him, because he returns us back to the original plan that we were supposed to be doing in the first place. Now, let's get into a little bit more of covenant renewal through Yeshua. Yeshua, the vassal, the messenger, and the threshold. We have lots of people right now, and that's really hard to read, so. We have lots of people going around right now that are always questioning Yeshua, are coming into our fellowships, coming into our groups, because they get a little bit of Judaism underneath their belt. They don't, study stuff out from every single angle, every single perspective that there is out there, and understanding who Yeshua is, how the hierarchy is set up, how kingdoms interact with one another, and they're just making rash decisions. And then they come in and they try to drag all these other people with them. Well, for one, we're not going to allow that kind of stuff here, so hopefully most of you are not concerned about that. But I want to be able to present to you a little bit of a different perspective so we understand the hierarchy to the kingdom, which doesn't take anything away from the Father's role or who he is. It doesn't take anything from who Yeshua is. It doesn't take anything away from who Israel is, and so on and so forth. It's about understanding how kingdoms were established and how they were set up and structured. You can't just have, a kingdom and then we think that everything is just we're floating on clouds. That's not a kingdom. A kingdom is there has to be a constitution, there has to be a government, there has to be people that are involved in that government, have specific roles, specific parts that they play, and that doesn't diminish one role from the other. Okay? So Matthew chapter 4, verse 1. Then Yeshua was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tried by the devil, and after having fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the trier came and said to him, I don't know why it says the trier. That's kind of a bad translation. If you are the son of Elohim, command that these stones become bread. Answering, he said, it has been written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of Yah. And this is directly from the book of Deuteronomy. I'm not going to read all the verses, but we can see that Yeshua, he comes up out of the water in Matthew chapter 3. Yahweh declares what? This is my son in whom I'm well pleased, and everybody heard that was around, right? I don't know how many people around the world would have heard it. Not for me to decide or to declare one way or the other, but it was made known to those people at that time that Yeshua is my son in whom I am well pleased. He declares to the world that this is who his son is, right? Immediately comes up out of the water. This is during his immersion process. Comes up, and then he's led into the wilderness by Hasatan. That's who the trier is, in case you were wondering who the trier was. But he's led into the wilderness for 40 days and for 40 nights. This is why I'm really interested to see this movie that's come out. Dylan, my son, found out that there's a movie right now that it's on video now? Yeah. It's on video. It's called The Last Days of the Desert or something like that. And it's a movie that somebody has created from the time that Yeshua comes up out of the water to him walking back into the land, all during his 40 days in the wilderness. So I'm kind of interested to see how they've gone with this movie. But there's a reason why he's doing all this. So Hasatan are doing all these things to him in the wilderness, trying to get him to bow down, right? Well, there's a purpose for that. But every single time that he tries to get him to do one of these temptations, is what does he do? He uses the book of Deuteronomy. This is the book that he uses. Why? Because that is a suzerain vassal treaty, and he's pointing it directly back to Hasatan's. Look, this is not my kingdom per se. This is the Father's kingdom, who he has established. I'm sent to be the vassal king. I'm the vassal king of Israel. Okay? And we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 3 and 4 here and again in a second. So check this out. So ancient Near Eastern legal terms that are also the same in ancient adoption contracts. So people actually would adopt people in the ancient world a little bit different than we are today. So this is when we read Genesis 15, it talks about Eleazar was one in his house, but he was to be the heir. Well, Eleazar wasn't his son, right? It wasn't Abraham's son. Well, what does that tell us? Well, if we know how ancient Near Eastern adoption contracts work, we can begin to see that the relationship they had is Abram basically adopted Eleazar into his house, gave him an inheritance, and they came into covenant with one another. So as he adopts Eleazar, this is why he said, this is the heir to my house, because he didn't have a son. So he adopts Eleazar so his family name or his goods or whatever, and all of his land that he owned could carry on to Eleazar and his sons. Well, Yah says, no, I'm going to give you a natural-born son. So anyway, Eleazar is adopted, but he didn't break the contract. So how does that work? In the ancient world, when you were adopted by somebody into their family, it was as if you were a natural-born son or daughter. So there was no, well, this is the second-class citizen because he's adopted, he's not my blood. No, the ancient world did not think that way. You brought in as a natural-born son if you were adopted. So that means Abraham and Eleazar still had this contract, and Eleazar didn't do anything to break it. He just knows that Yahweh came and said, no, he's not going to be your heir. We're going to send Isaac to be your heir. So how does that work? Well, and we can see this in the book of books that Paul writes, is that when you have a adopted son and then you have a natural-born son, is what happens is the natural-born son becomes the chief heir, and then the adopted sons become the co-heirs. So they basically have to submit to the natural-born heir. This is exactly what Paul talks about as us being co-heirs in the kingdom with Yeshua. Why? Because Yeshua is the only natural-born son to the Creator, number one. And we are the adopted son that came in that he gave an inheritance to. But we have to submit to the chief heir. This is legal adoption language, you guys. This is craziness. But we want to do away with all of this stuff with Yeshua because we don't actually understand, take time to investigate this stuff. Scripture is ancient, covenantal, legal language. Okay? Now, so the terms are father and son, adoption. When a vassal king submits to the suzerain, then the vassal king's people become adopted by the suzerain. Okay? So the vassal actually becomes part of Assyria, or they become part of Rome. They become part of... This is why there was providences and all of these things going on with Israel. Brother, term and parity covenants. We already talked about that. Love, ohev. We already talked about that. The term loyalty to the suzerain. I think I said it was yada, but actually to know is the word yada, which is actually points directly back to loving and being loyal to your king. Term used by the king who see the faithfulness of the vassal. Now, going back to Matthew chapter 3 and 4. And if you notice, this is why we always point everything back to Yeshua. We can study the Torah all day long, every single Shabbat. But if we're not going to go back and show how Yeshua did these things, we might as well just give up. You have to be able to show Yeshua in the New Testament connected to the covenant. And that's what we always want to do here. How many of you have ever seen this picture before? A few of you. Eli. This is a black obelisk of Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, showing Jehu, which is king of northern Israel at the time, or perhaps his emissary or his royal messenger, bowing before Shalmaneser and paying tribute to him in the year 841 BC. So basically what this means is bowing to another king while sworn oath to another is treason. Remember we talked about that, is that if you come into covenant, you swear an oath to that king, that if you go and you bow down and you swear an oath to another king, you've just committed treason against the king that you're in covenant with. Okay? You become the son of that new father that you are bowing down or swearing an oath to. This is exactly what happened here. King Jehu bows down to the king of Assyria when he was supposed to be in covenant with Yah, bows down to him, and now this guy becomes his new father, becomes his new king, and all this other kind of stuff. And the northern Israel just goes into haywire. What does this have to do with Matthew chapter 3 and 4? Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what's happening in the 40-day experience of Yeshua. Okay? I get excited about this part. So Yeshua comes up out of the water. Yahweh is the one who makes the oath and says that this is my son who I'm well pleased, right? Comes up out of the water, everybody hears, which, by the way, the sign coming out of the water is also an adoption process. So Yeshua's earthly father, I believe, has already passed. Yeshua goes and he gets immersed. John the Baptist, who is the legal heir to the priesthood, who can declare that this is the Lamb of God in chapter 1 of John, declares that this is the Lamb of God. He goes and he gets immersed, comes up out of the water. Yahweh says the oath that this is my son, gets led up into the wilderness by Hasatan. If Yeshua would have bowed down one time to Hasatan, Hasatan would become his father, and Yeshua would not be the Messiah, and he would not have the heir to the kingdom. It's legal adoption terminology in contracts. How all of these people would have understood these things. But what does Yeshua do? Is he actually uses 3 different times this book of Deuteronomy because it's the covenant. It's the reiteration of that generation that crossed into the land and that he was supposed to be the next legal heir to the Davidic kingdom and to the dynastic kingdom, which is the heavenly kingdom coming down. So if he bows down one time to Hasatan, he can't be the Messiah. But he doesn't do that. We know what he does. But this is actual ancient adoption terminology and language and customs that's going on in Matthew chapter 3 and 4. We never even realize. So tell me why, how can people just walk away from who Yeshua is if they don't understand what's going on in the actual text? Got to be careful. And it's up to you and I, hopefully, that we're doing a good enough job as we're here, reiterating who Yeshua is. Who Yahweh is. Yahweh is the king. Yahweh is the suzerain. Yeshua is the vassal. Yeshua is divine. I don't care what anybody says. If you got a problem with that, we could discuss it later. But he has to be divine. Why? Because we're talking about how kingdoms interacted. If a messenger comes or a vassal is put into place, that vassal has all the authority, all the attributes, all the character supposed to of the king in which sent him. You can't do away with the divinity of Yeshua and expect... I just don't understand. Moving on. As these pages are going to press, Dr. Saylor calls my attention, lo abor babaris, to enter or pass over into a covenant. This phrase, as Dr. Driver points out, is found only in one place, and that's in Deuteronomy 29, verse 12. That thou should enter or pass into covenants of the Lord thy God and into his oath, which the Lord thy God makes with thee this day. It is evident that here is the idea of passing over a line or boundary, or threshold limits into another region, or state, or condition. Until that threshold is crossed, the person is outside of the covenant and its privileges and its benefits. But when it is crossed or passed, the person is a partaker of all that is within it. So as soon as they cross over that line, this is the threshold covenant, right? This is established in the temple where they crossed the threshold of the temple and they would take care of all the expiation, the blood manipulation, everything of the sins of us, non-rebellious sins, is crossing a threshold. But you become a partaker in that covenant as soon as you cross that threshold, or the priest crossed that threshold on your behalf, right? Same thing happens with the land. They cross the land. As soon as they cross the land, they automatically get all the benefits of crossing into the land. This is what it means to cross over, and we see this in Deuteronomy 29. So check this out. Then Yeshua said unto them again, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep, and that all that ever come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door by me. If any man enters in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. This is directly referencing to him as being the door, the threshold. You pass over into covenant, and you're in covenant with Yeshua, then you get all of the benefits of all of the stuff in the covenant, right? Doesn't this put a little bit of fear in those people that you may know that are walking away from Yeshua, that are walking away from that whole threshold, that whole door that they must have or must go in to have all of the blessings of the covenant? But we don't look at things from this way. I think it is. In John chapter 10, I think it is. Because this whole chapter, I think, is talking about him being the shepherd and then him leading them into the way and that kind of stuff. Revelation chapter 1. And from Yeshua the Messiah, who is the faithful witness and the first begotten of the dead, and the prince of the kings of the earth, unto him that loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood, and has made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. To him be the glory and dominion over and over again. Now, the word that's used there for prince is archon, which basically means a first rank or power, chief ruler, magistrate, prince, or ruler. In the Hebrew, it actually puts right back to Adon, or Adonai. Sovereign, that is, controller, human or divine, Lord, master, owner. Compare also names beginning with Adonai. People want to talk about, well, you can't say Adonai because it's pagan. They have no idea what they're talking about. It's pointing to him being a king. It's pointing to him being the one in authority and all that kind of stuff. Walk away from all that stuff that says you can't say this or that because it's pagan. If that was the case, we might as well just all start speaking Hebrew and stop speaking English. Because you're going to find all sorts of pagan origins to every English word you could possibly think of. You know? But they don't understand the term. So this is pointing to him. It says prince. Does that diminish his authority of who he is? No, that means that the Father gave him a specific position in the authority and hierarchy of the kingdom. Right? This is all about the hierarchy of the kingdom. And I know you're not going to be able to see this, so I'm going to have to read it to you. And we're going to close with this. This is showing the structure of the restored kingdom. So people have issues, well, how is Yeshua going to rule or do all these things with the kingdom? How is it going to be reestablished? It's right here in 1 Corinthians 1:15 if you understand suzerain vassal treaties. It says, and if my Messiah has not been raised, and our proclaiming is empty, and your belief also empty. And we are also found false witnesses of Elohim, because we have witnessed of Elohim, and he has raised up Messiah, whom he did not raise up. If then the dead are not raised, for if the dead are not raised, then neither Messiah has been raised. And if Messiah has not been raised, your belief is to no purpose. You are still in your sins. That should scare people enough by itself. Then also those who have fallen asleep in Messiah have perished. If in this life only we have expectation in Messiah, we are of all men the most wretched. But now Messiah has been raised from the dead and has become the first fruit of those having fallen asleep. For since death is through a man, resurrection of the dead is also through a man. For as all die in Adam, so also all men shall be made alive in Messiah. And each in his own order. Messiah the first fruits, then those who are of Messiah at his coming, then the end, when he delivers up the reign of Elohim. Here it is. When he delivers up the reign to Elohim the Father, when he has brought to naught all rule and all authority and power, for he has to reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy is to be brought to naught is death. For he has put all under his feet, but when he says all are put under him, it is clear that he who put all under him is accepted. And when all are made subject to him, then the Son himself shall also be subject to him who put all under him, in order that Elohim be made all in all. Now this gets a little bit confusing because we don't understand who the hims, the he's, the haws, and the who's, and the what's, and the where's, and all that kind of stuff. Let me put this in a little perspective. Here we have, Israel is spread across all the earth. We're in exile. Did all these things. Yeshua has to come back. I don't know when it's coming. I don't have a date. I'm not going to predict any dates. I'm not going to give you any type of time frame whatsoever. All I know is that I look at suzerain vassal treaties and how covenants were established, and I can have a guesstimation on the process that it's going to happen. So Israel's in exile. Yeshua is eventually going to come back. He's going to reestablish Israel, crossing them into the land. I believe that Israel will be led into the wilderness, those that are claiming to be in covenant with him. Claiming to be in covenant with him. And if you go through the Torah, one of the reasons why we read the Torah is because we have to see all these things that happened to them in the wilderness experience, all of the purgings, all